A true story about this grandma. She waited 50 years for a lost love. The kettle whistled at dusk. The kettle always whistles around 5. Like it remembers. It was late October in Minnesota, the kind where the cold doesn't knock. It lets itself in. The wind moved through the trees behind Grandma Ruth's house with the soft insistence of memory. That wind had a sound to it, like someone gently calling your name from far away. Not loud, but just enough to make you turn your head. Inside, the small kitchen was warm, the old stove humming softly. A cast-iron kettle, blackened by decades of use, began to whistle. Ruth didn't rush to it. She never did. These days, she let things happen at their own pace. There was no one waiting on tea but her. She pulled the shawl tighter around her thin shoulders and made her way over. The kettle was older than some of her grandchildren. Maybe older than all of them, come to think of it. She poured the water slowly, methodically, into her favorite blue and white mug, cracked on one side, and set it gently on the table next to the window. Outside, the trees were turning, red like rust, gold like old wedding rings, and some still stubbornly green. She watched a single leaf detach itself from a high branch and spiral down. It reminded her of a letter falling through time. She sipped the tea and let the quiet take its place in the room. It was always quiet now. Her house, once filled with noise and burnt toast and teenagers yelling about chores, had shrunk to the size of this kitchen, and the tea, and the kettle, and the silence. But something felt different today. It wasn't the tea. That was the same brand she'd been drinking since 1978. It wasn't the weather. That wind had blown through every October she could remember. No, it was something else. Something in her bones. A hum, deep and distant, like a name you haven't spoken aloud in decades, suddenly pressing on your chest. She hadn't thought of him in months, maybe longer. That was the promise she'd made to herself long ago. Don't stir up old ghosts. What's done is done, and what's gone stays gone. And yet, she found herself whispering his name. James. The sound surprised her. The room felt like it leaned in. She looked down at her tea, suddenly ashamed, as if caught in some act of betrayal. Her late husband, Harold, had been a good man, solid, faithful, built her this house with his own 2 hands. But James had been her first, her real first. It had been over 50 years since she'd last seen him. And yet, in that moment, as the dusk curled around the corners of her kitchen window, she could feel him like he'd just stepped out back to bring in firewood. The kettle's whistle faded, but the echo of it remained in her chest. She stood slowly and walked over to the cabinet where she kept the old letters. She hadn't touched that box in years, maybe decades. But today something had shifted. Her hands trembled as she opened it. There they were, his letters, all of them, tied with a fraying ribbon the color of cornflowers. She pulled out the first one, dated March 12th, 1967. Her breath caught. Absolutely, here is part 2, continuing directly from the soft, emotional pull of part 1. The tone remains warm, natural, and introspective, written in American English, without hyphens or special characters. The woman in the window. Ruth did not read the letter that night. She held it for a long time, though, just sat there with the folded envelope resting in her lap like something holy. Her fingers brushed the faded stamp, and she could feel the texture of his handwriting, slightly raised against the aged paper. She had never forgotten the way he wrote her name, always with a little curve on the R and just the tiniest space before the U, like he had hesitated, like saying her name meant something more than just calling her. She placed the letter back into the box and tied the ribbon again, slower this time. It was not time yet. Some memories need a little space to breathe before they can speak. The next morning, Ruth was up before the sun. She always was. The body keeps the schedule long after the reasons for it disappear. Back when Harold was alive, he liked bacon early and coffee hot. Back when the kids were still home, it was school lunches and missing socks and someone yelling from the hallway that the car keys were gone again. Now it was just her and the silence, but she still moved the same, still made the same 2 eggs, still put the coffee on before her slippers were even all the way on her feet. She settled into the armchair by the front window. That chair had known every season. She had nursed babies there, held her granddaughter during a thunderstorm, sewn patches on jeans, and once cried herself to sleep during a blizzard in 1982 when Harold had gotten lost on the way back from town. From the window, she could see the front yard, the road beyond it, and the slow sway of the birch trees in the wind. She liked this view. Nothing ever happened, and that was the beauty of it. Still, lately, she had become the kind of woman people waved to out of habit. Kids on bikes, mailmen, the occasional neighbor walking their dog. No one ever stopped. Not really. Not since Harold passed. They just nodded, smiled politely, and went on. And she understood. People have lives, places to be. But sometimes she wished someone would knock, even just to borrow sugar. The letter stayed on her mind all day, like a song humming at the edge of hearing. She found herself reaching for the box again that afternoon. She did not mean to. Her hands just moved that way, like the part of her that had waited 50 years for something, had finally gotten tired of waiting. She opened the second drawer in the side table, and there it was, the same box, the same ribbon. She untied it, like a woman unlocking a secret she had kept even from herself. She pulled out the March letter again, then the one after that, April, then June. She read the first line, "Dearest Ruth." She had to stop. There it was, the ache she had buried deep for so long. It had almost turned to stone, but it was still soft underneath, still tender. And suddenly, she felt all of 17 again, back in her father's old truck, barefoot and smiling, with James's hand on hers and the wind in her hair. Funny how the years fall away when someone says your name like they mean it. She stood up and carried the letter to the window. Outside, the afternoon was turning amber, that golden hour light that made everything seem older and kinder. She sat back down and looked out again. There was a car passing, then nothing, just stillness. And in the reflection of the window glass, she caught a glimpse of herself. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman looking back. Gray hair pinned loosely, face soft, with lines carved by laughter and loss. Eyes the color of faded denim. But behind those eyes, something had awakened. Something not quite grief, not quite joy either. Maybe it was hope. She set the letter on the windowsill and breathed in deep. The house smelled of dust and sunlight and something baking far off, probably the Nelsons next door. She whispered his name again, James. And the sound of it settled in the room, like an old friend pulling up a chair. She thought then of all the years that had passed, all the holidays, the weddings, the funerals, the tiny victories and the quiet heartbreaks. And she thought of how love, real love, does not end. It just finds a quiet place to wait. She picked up the letter again, and this time she read, word for word, line by line. And by the end of it, her hands were shaking. Because what he wrote that day, in March of 1967, was not just a letter. It was a promise. A promise he said he would keep. If you ever need me, Ruth, just write me back. I will be waiting. Always. She closed her eyes. The wind outside picked up, lifting the leaves in soft circles. And for the first time in decades, Ruth began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had waited too. The family she built. The letter stayed on the windowsill that night. Ruth did not touch it again. She left it there like someone might a candle, or a prayer, or an old photograph, too precious to tuck away. It became a part of the room, a silent guest. The next morning brought the sound of the old wall clock ticking like a soft heartbeat. And for the first time in years, Ruth was not alone in the house. Her daughter, Linda, had arrived the night before with 2 suitcases, a laptop bag, and a worried smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Mom, I just needed a few days to breathe. Do you mind if I stay through the weekend?" Ruth had nodded and said of course. But she knew the truth. Linda did not come just to breathe. She came because adult children always know when something is shifting in their parents. There is a subtle change in voice or the way they answer the phone. Something beneath the words. A pause. A forgetting. Or sometimes just a silence, too long to be normal. So Linda came. Ruth watched her now through the kitchen doorway. She was sitting at the table, answering emails, sipping coffee, and frowning at a spreadsheet like it had insulted her. Ruth smiled softly. Linda had always been serious. Even as a child, she lined up her dolls in alphabetical order and got frustrated when her little brother put them out of place. But she had a good heart, a deep one, like Harold. She looked so much like him sometimes that Ruth's breath caught. It had been nearly 15 years since he passed. A quiet heart attack on a Tuesday morning. He was in the garden pulling weeds. She was inside making toast. 1 minute he was there. The next minute, the whole world tilted. And Ruth had to learn how to live again. Without his laugh. Without his steady hands fixing the front step. Without his toothbrush beside hers in the cup. She had not cried at the funeral. She had stood still, hands folded, looking at the casket like it was just another piece of furniture. People whispered that she was strong. But the truth was, grief had not known where to land. It had waited, pooled quietly behind her ribs until it found its shape in the evenings, in the smallness of the bed, in the hush of dinner for one. Still, Ruth had never stopped loving Harold. He had been a good man, not the kind who lit up a room, but the kind who built the room from the floor up and never let the roof leak. When they met in 1969, she was still raw from James, still carrying the ache like a scar tucked beneath her smile. Harold never asked about it. He knew there were pages in her life he would not get to read. But he married her anyway, and he loved her well. Their life was not made of grand things. It was made of small ones. The hum of a lawnmower, the clink of spoons in coffee mugs, the way his fingers brushed hers when they passed each other in the hallway, and the children. 3 of them, Linda first, then David, then little Emily, who arrived just as they had begun to think 2 was enough. Ruth had mothered with a quiet steadiness. She knew how to sew buttons and listen without interrupting. She made excellent meatloaf and terrible gravy and read the comics every Sunday like it was scripture. She taught them kindness, taught them the value of thank you notes, and how to shake a hand properly, and why you never, ever let the dog up on the good couch. They had grown, as children do, pulled away in stretches, came back in folds, each carrying bits of her in their hands. But none of them knew about James. Not really. There had been one time, years ago, when Emily had found an old photograph in the attic. A black and white snapshot of Ruth at 17, standing beside a young man in uniform. He was laughing. She was looking at him. "Mom, who is this?" "Just an old friend," she had said, and closed the box. Now, Ruth sat in her chair and looked at Linda at the table and felt the weight of all the things she had never said. Not out of shame, not out of regret, but out of some instinct to protect what she had built, to not let the ghost of what could have been haunt the very real love she had been given. But things were shifting. She could feel it. There was a letter on her windowsill that was older than her marriage, and there was a question rising in her chest like smoke. What if he was still out there? What if he had waited? What if she wrote him back? Ruth turned her eyes from the window and looked at Linda. She saw the curve of her daughter's jaw, the worry behind her eyes, the laptop, the coffee, the long sigh she had just let out. She had given Linda a safe life, a solid one, but she wondered if her daughter ever knew what it meant to be caught in the middle of two kinds of love, the kind that built a life and the kind that never left. Ruth stood slowly. Her knees ached in the way they always did after sitting too long. She walked to the kitchen, pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet, and poured the coffee. She set one in front of Linda. "Thanks, Mom." Ruth sat across from her, and for a long moment she said nothing. Just let the silence settle like warm steam from the mugs. Then finally, she spoke. "Linda, do you remember that box in the attic? Which one? The one with the old letters?" Beat passed. "Yeah, I think so." "Why?" Ruth looked out the window again. The letter was still there, waiting. "I think it might be time you knew the whole story." The letter that changed everything. The house had never felt so still. Linda sat at the table, both hands wrapped around her coffee cup. The steam rose between them, thin and quiet, like breath in cold air. Ruth had not looked at her since she said it, since she mentioned the box, since she said there was a story Linda did not know. She was still staring out the window, eyes far away, like she was watching something that was not really there. Linda finally broke the silence. "You mean the box with the letters?" Ruth nodded slowly. "From someone you knew before Dad?" Another nod. Linda leaned back, quiet for a beat. Then she said softly, "Was it someone you loved?" Ruth turned then. Her eyes met her daughter's, and for the first time in years, she did not try to mask the answer. "Yes." The word hung in the room like a held breath. His name was James. Linda stayed quiet. She did not look shocked. She did not frown or fold her arms or rush to interrupt. She just waited. Ruth felt a sudden ache of gratitude for that. "We met in the spring of 1966. I was 17. He was 19 and just about to ship off for the Navy. He came into my father's hardware store looking for a wrench. I did not know a thing about tools, but I was behind the counter that day, and I guess he thought I looked like someone who could help." Ruth smiled, small and far away. He had the kind of smile that made you feel like summer just stepped into the room. "We talked for maybe 10 minutes, and I knew. I just knew. It sounds silly now, but back then, you could believe in things like that, without needing a reason." Linda listened, without blinking. "We spent that whole summer together. He would drive out in his old Ford pickup and park by the river. We would sit and talk for hours. He wrote poetry sometimes. Not good poetry, but it made me laugh. He gave me a necklace he made from a shell he found in Corpus Christi. I still have it. I wore it under my clothes the day I married your father. Ruth let the words settle. The truth of them. Why did it end, Mom? He was sent overseas. Vietnam. He wrote me as often as he could. At first, the letters came every week, then once a month, then less, then nothing. I waited. I checked the mailbox every day for a year. And then, one day, I got a letter from a man named Carl. He was in James's unit. Ruth reached for her coffee, but did not drink it. Her hands were trembling slightly. The letter said James was missing in action, that it happened during a supply run. They never found him, just his boots and his canteen near the edge of a river. No body, no goodbye, just gone. Linda inhaled slowly. Mom, I am so sorry. Ruth gave her a thin smile. I mourned him in silence. My parents did not approve of him. Said I was too young and he was too wild. They did not even know we were engaged. He had asked me the night before he left. No ring, just his hand over mine, and the softest look in his eyes. I said yes. I never told anyone. And then you met Dad? Ruth nodded. Harold was steady. He was safe. I needed something that did not feel like it could disappear. And he never asked about my past. He just offered me a future. You never stopped loving James, no. But I never stopped loving Harold either. They were different kinds of love. One was fire, one was shelter. Linda sat back in her chair. Her eyes had gone glassy. Mom, why tell me now? Because the letter from James never really stopped. Or at least, one did not. The one I found 2 nights ago. It was in the old box, dated March 1967, months after he went missing. It was never opened. I must have tucked it away in the grief and forgot. Or maybe I was not ready to read it back then. Ruth stood slowly and crossed to the windowsill. She picked up the letter with both hands and walked it over to the table. She set it down gently between them. I read it yesterday. He was alive, Linda. After all that, he said he would come back, that if I ever needed him, I should write. Linda stared at the letter. It looked harmless, fragile, just paper and ink. But it had changed everything. Do you think he is still out there? Ruth let out a long breath. I do not know. It has been 50 years. Maybe he passed on. Maybe he built a life. But maybe he is waiting. Maybe he kept that promise. Do you want to find him? I think I have to try. The words felt strange on her tongue, like something cracked open inside her, and the light was finally coming through. Linda reached out and took her mother's hand. Then we will find him, Mom. Together. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again. Not cold this time. Not haunting. Just a breeze. And in that quiet moment, with the letter between them and the past wide open, Ruth felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt young again. The years in between time does not ask permission to move on. It just does, whether you are ready or not. After James disappeared and the last letter went unread, Ruth had found herself drifting through the days like someone underwater. Everything looked familiar, but felt far away. The kitchen still smelled of cinnamon in the mornings. The wind still rattled the screen door at night, but she was not really there. Not fully. It was her mother who finally said the words. You need to stop waiting, Ruth. He is not coming back. Life is for the living. Ruth had nodded politely, but deep down she disagreed. You could be alive and still waiting. That was what she had been doing. For months, maybe longer. And then Harold came along. He was not loud or charming or full of promises. He was quiet, gentle. He noticed things, like the way she always turned her teacup twice before drinking, or how she pressed her lips together when she was holding back tears. He started showing up at the hardware store on Saturdays. Sometimes he would buy a single nail or a roll of tape, sometimes nothing at all. He just stood near her, hands in his coat pockets, and asked how her week had been. After a while, she stopped dreading the quiet. They married in the fall of 1970. It was a small ceremony. No veil, no music, just close family and a breeze that tugged at the leaves like they were trying to stay on a little longer. Ruth wore pale blue. Something about white did not feel right. Not then. Harold built her a house with wide windows and a porch that faced the west. He planted birch trees out front because she once told him they were her favorite. They had children. Linda first, then David, then Emily, who arrived on a snowy night with cheeks the color of ripe apples. Life became full. There were school mornings and skinned knees and laundry that never seemed to end. There were Christmas mornings that smelled like pine and cinnamon. There were scraped dinner plates and car rides to soccer practice and flu seasons that knocked the whole house down for a week. It was loud, messy, beautiful, and through it all, Ruth tucked the ache away like a photograph in the back of a drawer. She never stopped wondering, but she did stop asking. It was easier that way. You cannot mourn every day. It would eat you alive. Harold never asked about her past, but once, many years later, long after the kids had grown, he had come across the box in the attic. He did not open it, just held it in his hands, looked at her, and said, "Do you want me to throw this out?" She had paused, then shook her head. No, not yet. And that was it. No questions, no accusations. Just a man who loved her enough to let her have her secrets. She gave him everything she had left. A soft kind of love. A worn-in comfort that grew stronger with time. They learned each other's rhythms. They grew old, like trees beside each other. Steady, rooted. But there were moments when a certain song came on the radio, or when the wind blew in just right through the bedroom window, or when she found herself staring out across the river, remembering the sound of James's laugh and the way he said her name, like it was something he wanted to keep safe. She never spoke it aloud, but it was there, always there. When Harold died, the silence came back. Not like it had in her youth. This was different. This was the silence of a woman who had carried two kinds of love in her chest for a lifetime and now had only memories to hold. Her children visited often in the first year, then less, not out of neglect, but because life kept moving. They had jobs and families and bills and calendars filled with appointments. Ruth kept the house tidy. She baked, she read, she watched the birds outside her window and learned their names. And some nights, she dreamed of a younger version of herself, barefoot in the grass, standing beside a boy with gentle hands and a promise in his voice. And now, after all these years, she was holding that promise again, that letter, the one she had never opened, the one that had waited as long as she had. Linda had gone back home for a few days to arrange her work schedule, but before she left, she kissed her mother's cheek and said, "We are going to find him, whatever it takes." Ruth had smiled, but said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that hope was a delicate thing. You held it loosely, or not at all. Still, that night, she opened the box again. She read the March letter for the third time. Every word carved into her heart, like initials on a tree. "If you ever need me, Ruth, just write me back. I will be waiting. Always." She closed the letter and held it to her chest. 50 years had passed. 50 autumns, 50 Christmases, 50 springs, and still the words felt new. Outside, the birch trees swayed gently in the wind. Inside, Ruth sat in the same chair she had nursed her babies in, had cried in, had kissed Harold goodnight beside for 40 years. And for the first time in all the years in between, she allowed herself to say it out loud. "James, where are you?" A quiet reminder. It started with the radio, a Thursday morning, bright but cool, the kind of day that smelled faintly of apples and dry leaves, like the season had been baking something overnight. Ruth was doing what she always did after breakfast. She washed the dishes by hand, even though the dishwasher worked just fine. She liked the warmth of the water, the rhythm of it. Some things felt better slow. The radio was on in the background, playing an oldies station. A commercial came and went, then a soft guitar picked up, simple and steady. A male voice followed, low and tender. It was not the song itself that made her stop, but the memory that rode in with it. A field, a sky full of stars, and the windows down on James's old truck. They had parked just past the county line. He had reached over, turned the knob on the radio, and said, "This one makes me think of you." She remembered laughing and saying something about how corny he was. But the truth was, she had not stopped smiling the entire way home. Ruth dropped the dish towel. She leaned against the counter, both hands gripping the edge. The song played on, gentle as breath. She did not cry. Not yet. She just closed her eyes and let it all come back. The truck, the cool night air, the way his fingers tapped the steering wheel in time with the music. When the song ended, the DJ came on. That one was from 1966, folks. You do not hear it much these days. Someone called in and requested it for their sweetheart. 50 years together. Ain't that something? Ruth let out a soft sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something in between. She turned off the radio. The house went still again, but her mind did not. She stood in the middle of her kitchen and realized she could not just go back to folding towels and watering the plants and pretending this did not matter. The letter had cracked something open. The song had made it move. It was time. She walked to the hutch in the dining room where she kept her stationery, the same pale blue paper she had used to write thank you notes for decades. She had no idea what to say, where to send it, if he was even still alive. But she knew she had to start. She sat down, pen in hand. For a long time, she just stared at the paper. "Dear James," she stopped. Her hand trembled slightly. She took a breath. "I do not know if this will reach you. I do not even know if you are still in this world. But I found your letter, the one from 1967, and I cannot stop thinking about it." Another pause. "I married a good man. I had a good life. But there was always a part of me that waited. I think you know that already. If you are out there, if you remember me, if you want to talk, I would like that. I think it might be time." She signed it simply. Ruth. Then came the hard part. Where to send it? She had no address, no number, no idea where he might be. She had not spoken his full name aloud in decades. And yet, she remembered it like her own. James Raymond Connors. She wrote it at the top of the envelope and then left the address line blank. It felt foolish, hopeful, impossible. That night, when Linda called, Ruth mentioned it. "I wrote him a letter today." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Linda said, "Did you send it?" "I have no idea where to send it. Maybe we can find him." "Mom, it is not 1967 anymore. We have the internet now." Ruth smiled. Do you think Google can find a heart that disappeared? I think we should try. The next day, Linda arrived with her laptop, a notepad, and a determination that made Ruth laugh. They searched everything they could: public records, obituaries, military service sites. They found 3 James Connors who had served in Vietnam. 2 were no longer living. The third one lived in Montana, a retired park ranger. He had a birthday in September. He would be turning 78, same age as James. Ruth stared at the screen. Montana. He had always talked about wanting to live near mountains, said the ocean was too loud and the city too crowded. But the mountains, that was where a man could think. Linda looked at her. Do you want me to call? No, then. Ruth reached for the letter. I want to mail it. What if he is not the same man? Then I will know. So they wrote the address. Ruth licked the stamp slowly and pressed it onto the envelope like sealing a secret. She held the letter in her lap on the drive to the post office. Linda offered to drop it in the box, but Ruth shook her head. Some things a person has to do themselves. She stood in front of the blue box, her hands tight around the envelope. For a moment, she almost turned away. But then she remembered the music, the truck, the promise, and she let it go. The letter fell through the slot with a soft sound. It was done. Outside, the trees were beginning to shed their leaves, and inside her chest, something had shifted. She had sent the letter. Whatever came next would come. Echoes of the past. 3 days passed. The leaves outside Ruth's window turned a deeper shade of gold. The air had a sharpness to it now, the kind that hinted at winter, waiting in the wings. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders most mornings and sat with her coffee at the kitchen table, watching the birch trees sway. She did not mention the letter to anyone else. Linda had gone back to Minneapolis, promising to return by the weekend. Ruth told her not to fuss, but deep down, she liked the idea of her daughter being near. It had been a long time since someone sat beside her just to sit. Most visits had a purpose: a holiday, a birthday, a doctor's appointment. This waiting felt different. Not heavy exactly, but charged, like the quiet before a storm, or maybe the quiet before something good. That Thursday morning, she woke with a thought that would not leave her alone. The river. She had not been back there since before she married Harold. Not once in 50 years. It was not far. Just a short drive out past the edge of town, where the roads turned narrow and the fields stretched wide. James used to take her there. It was their spot. A flat stretch of land where the trees opened just enough to let the light come in. They would lie on an old quilt and talk for hours, the water humming beside them. He carved her initials into the bark of an elm once. She remembered watching his hands, the way he focused, the way he smiled when she teased him about spelling her middle name wrong. Ruth pulled her coat from the closet. It still smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke. She slipped on her old walking shoes and grabbed the car keys from the hook by the door. The drive felt strangely familiar, even though the landscape had changed. New houses, a gas station where there used to be a cornfield, but the trees still stood tall. The light still danced the same way across the hills. When she turned off the main road and onto the gravel path that led to the riverbank, her hands tightened slightly on the wheel. She parked beneath a sycamore tree and sat still for a long moment. The wind rustled the leaves above her, and she could hear the water before she saw it. Stepping out, she was surprised by how steady her legs felt. At 78, she moved slower, but her body still remembered this place. Her heart certainly did. The path was overgrown, but still visible. She walked slowly, one foot in front of the other, letting her eyes take in everything. The smell of the river, the crunch of leaves beneath her shoes, the way the sun filtered through the branches in soft gold ribbons. And then she saw it, the clearing. It was smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she had just gotten older. The elm tree was still there, a little crooked now, its bark weathered. She ran her fingers across it, searching, and there it was. RR plus JC inside a shaky heart, faded, but still there. She let her hand rest on the carving, not crying, just remembering. Her breath caught in her throat, not from sadness, but from the sheer force of memory. He had kissed her here, told her he loved her here, promised her the moon, and meant it. She sank down onto a patch of grass and let her body settle. The quilt was gone, the years were gone, but the feeling was still there. That softness, that certainty, that strange, beautiful belief that something once true could still be real again. The river flowed gently beside her. Time did not stop for anyone, but here, it felt like it slowed down just long enough for her to breathe. She stayed until the shadows began to lengthen. Then she stood, brushed the leaves from her coat, and placed her hand on the carving one more time. Thank you. She did not say it out loud, but she felt it in her chest. Back at the car, she sat for a few minutes before turning the key. The engine started with a familiar hum, and she eased back onto the gravel road. On the way home, the sky turned a pale pink. When she pulled into the driveway, something caught her eye. A white envelope sticking out of the mailbox. Her heart skipped. She walked to it slowly, trying to stay calm. It was not from Montana. It was a utility bill. She let out a breath and almost laughed. She carried it inside and placed it on the counter without opening it. That night, she did not sleep much. She lay in bed, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling, listening to the old house breathe around her. But her thoughts were not heavy. They were full. Of the river, of the carving, of a boy who once loved her so deeply, he promised her forever, with nothing more than a pocket knife and a smile. And of the letter she had sent. Somewhere out there, it was making its way through the world. And maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for it. The search begins. It started with the coffee. That next morning, Ruth sat in her usual chair, her hands curled around a warm mug, steam rising into the soft morning light. She watched the mailbox from the window, as if willing something to appear. But nothing came. Not yet. Linda arrived just after 10, juggling a laptop, a grocery bag, and a bagel she had taken exactly 2 bites out of before giving up on eating in the car. "You did not have to come today," Ruth said, as she took the bag from her hands. "Mom, you mailed a letter to a man you have not seen in 50 years. I am not going to miss what happens next." Ruth smiled and handed her a napkin. "And what happens next? We find him." It was said so simply, as if it were a thing you could check off a to-do list between folding laundry and picking up a prescription. But Ruth saw the way Linda's eyes moved, sharp, focused, already turning possibilities over in her mind. They sat up at the kitchen table, side by side like old study partners. Linda opened the laptop and pulled up a map of Montana. She zoomed into a small town, nestled near a string of lakes and hills. There, a place called Clearwater. This is where the James Connors we found lives. Retired park ranger. There is a listing for him here in an old state registry. No phone number, but there is a mailing address. Ruth stared at the screen. The town looked small, friendly, the kind of place where people waved from their porches and knew which dog belonged to which house. "Do you think it is him?" Linda hesitated. "Honestly, I do not know, but it is a start. And if it is not, we just keep going. Ruth looked down at her hands. They were older now, skin soft with time, veins like quiet rivers beneath the surface, hands that had held babies and wiped tears and folded thousands of loads of laundry, hands that had let go of too many things too early. She flexed them slightly and said, "I want to call someone." Linda blinked. "Who? Carl? Carl? He was the one who wrote me when James went missing. They served together. He must have known more than he put in the letter. Do you still have his name?" "Yes. It was in the return address. I never threw it away." Linda nodded. "Give me a few minutes." It took longer than a few minutes. There were a lot of Carls. Some had moved. Some had passed on. But finally, they found one with a military record that matched. Carl Henley, born in 1947, lives in Indiana. A listing showed a landline number. Ruth stared at the digits. "Do you want me to call?" "No, I need to hear his voice myself." Linda handed her the phone. Ruth punched in the numbers slowly. Her finger paused over the last one, then pressed. The line rang once, twice, then a voice. Rough, tired, male. "Hello? Mr. Henley?" "Speaking. My name is Ruth Miller. I am calling about someone you served with in Vietnam. James Connors." Silence. Then a sound. Like an exhale held too long. "You said Ruth?" "Yes." "Dear Lord." There was a pause. Then he said, "I never thought I would hear that name again. Did he survive?" Ruth's voice broke slightly. Carl took a breath. "He did. Barely. We got separated during that ambush. I thought he was dead for days, but he made it. Lost a lot of blood. Took a long time to recover." "Why did you write me and say he was missing?" "Because he told me to." "What?" "He asked me not to tell you he made it. Said he was broken. Said he did not want to ruin your life. Said you deserved better than a man full of ghosts." Ruth sat back in her chair. The room tilted slightly. "He thought he was doing the right thing. I told him he was an idiot, but he would not listen. He went back home, moved west, started a quiet life. I kept in touch for a while, but eventually he stopped writing. I figured he did not want to be found." Ruth swallowed. "Do you know where he is now?" "No, but if I had to bet, I would say Montana. He always talked about the mountains. Said they were quiet in a way that made sense to him." She felt the phone trembling in her hand. Linda gently took it and whispered something to Carl. "Thank you. We will keep looking." Ruth sat very still. He lived. He had made a choice, not out of hate, not even out of abandonment, but out of some twisted form of love. She felt anger rise, then grief, then something else, something harder to name. "He was trying to protect you," Linda said. "I know, but it still hurt." She looked back at the screen. The address in Clearwater stared back at her. "I want to go," she said softly. "To Montana?" "Yes, in person. I want to look him in the eyes." Linda hesitated. "Are you sure?" Ruth nodded. "I have waited 50 years. It is time to stop waiting." A door left ajar. The road to Montana stretched out like a ribbon of memory. Ruth sat in the passenger seat of Linda's car. The window cracked just slightly enough to let in the scent of pine and the crisp hum of mountain air. They had left early that morning, a thermos of coffee between them and a cooler of sandwiches in the back seat. Linda offered to fly, but Ruth had said no. Some journeys needed to be made by road. She wanted to see the country pass by, wanted to feel the slow approach. 50 years had come and gone. Another 2 days would not matter. Besides, there was something sacred in watching the landscape change. The flat fields of Minnesota gave way to hills. The air grew thinner, the trees taller, and the sky, God, the sky went on forever. They spoke in patches about the towns they passed, about Ruth's favorite meals to make in the fall, about Linda's boys, and how fast they were growing. But mostly, they sat in companionable silence. By the time they crossed into Montana, Ruth felt her chest tighten. What if he did not remember her? What if he had a wife? A life? What if he had died before the letter even reached him? They pulled into Clearwater late in the afternoon on the third day. It was smaller than Linda expected. Just a post office, a diner, a gas station, and a scattering of homes tucked along the foothills. Ruth stared out the window as they rolled slowly down Main Street. A few people waved. One man tipped his hat. "He would have liked it here," she whispered. Linda followed the directions they had written down. Just past the edge of town, the houses thinned. Trees lined the road like quiet sentinels. Then came the mailbox, rusted, leaning slightly, the name still legible. Connors. "That is it," Linda said, pulling into the gravel driveway. Ruth said nothing. The house was simple. A single-story cabin with weathered wood siding and a wide porch. Wind chimes danced gently in the breeze. A stack of firewood sat neatly against the side. A rocking chair, a dog bowl on the step. Linda turned off the car. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No," Ruth said softly. "Let me try first." She opened the car door and stepped out. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes. Her legs ached from the drive, but she kept walking. Up the steps, across the porch. She knocked, then waited. A moment passed, then another. She knocked again. Still nothing. She turned to look at Linda, who watched her with quiet concern from the car. Then Ruth tried the door. It opened. Just a crack. Not locked. She called out, "Hello!" Her voice barely broke the stillness. She stepped inside. The air was clean, not stale. The kind of house that was lived in, but not cluttered. A bookshelf, a hat on a hook, a framed photo on a side table of a man in uniform, younger, smiling, beside a tall mountain lake. Ruth moved slowly. "James?" Her voice trembled on his name. No answer. Then a sound. Soft footsteps behind her. She turned. A woman stood in the doorway. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Short dark hair, jeans, flannel shirt. She looked at Ruth with wide eyes. "Can I help you?" I am sorry," Ruth said quickly. "I thought maybe... Is this James Connor's home?" The woman's face changed. Not anger, not confusion. Something else. Recognition. "Yes, but he is not here right now." "Do you know when he will be back?" The woman hesitated. "He is my father." Ruth's heart skipped. "He is alive?" "Yes, but he is not well. He is at the VA Hospice Center in Missoula. He went in a few weeks ago. His heart has been failing." Ruth reached for the wall to steady herself. "I sent him a letter." The woman nodded slowly. "He got it." Ruth looked up. "He did?" "Yes. I was with him when it arrived. He held it in his hands for a long time. Did not open it at first. Just stared at your name. Then he finally did. And he cried." Ruth felt her knees buckle. The woman stepped forward quickly. "Here, sit down." Ruth sank into a chair near the window. The room was bright. The wind outside pushed against the trees like a hush. "He cried. He said he never thought you would forgive him, that he was sure you had moved on. He said sending that letter was the kindest and cruelest thing that ever happened to him." Ruth looked down at her lap. "I did move on, but I never forgot him." The woman pulled over another chair. "Would you like to see him?" "Yes. Then you should come tomorrow. He is still himself most mornings. Afternoons are harder. But he asks about you. Keep saying your name like it is part of a prayer." Ruth looked at her. "What is your name?" "Claire." Are you, I mean, are you his daughter? Claire smiled gently. Adopted. He never married. But he found me when I needed someone. He has been my father in every way that matters. Ruth reached out and took her hand. Thank you for telling me. Claire gave her hand a squeeze. Thank you for coming. Outside, the sun began to sink behind the hills. Ruth stood and walked to the window. The light turned everything gold. And in that golden hour, in a house filled with memory, she felt something loosen inside her. Tomorrow, she would see him. After 50 years, he was still here, and the door had not been closed. It had only been left ajar. The meeting, the morning air in Missoula, was soft and cold, the kind that made your breath visible and your heart beat just a little slower. Linda drove, while Ruth sat silently in the passenger seat, hands folded over her purse, eyes fixed on the mountains ahead. The sun was just beginning to crest the hills, painting the sky a pale rose. Neither of them spoke much. There was not much left to say. They pulled into the hospice parking lot just after 8, a single-story building surrounded by evergreens, its windows glowing faintly with warm light. A nurse held the door open as they stepped inside. Claire was already waiting in the lobby. She rose from a chair and offered a quiet smile. He is awake, she said. He knows you are coming. He is nervous, but happy. I think more happy than anything else. Ruth nodded. I am not sure I can do this. You already are, Claire said gently, and you do not have to do it alone. She walked them down a long hallway, soft with carpet and quiet with the stillness of early morning. Each door they passed had a nameplate. A few were open, letting out muffled television sounds or the soft clatter of breakfast trays. Claire stopped in front of room 1008. She knocked gently, then peeked in. James, she said softly. She's here. Ruth felt her knees lock in place. Linda touched her shoulder. I will wait out here, Mom. Take your time. Claire opened the door and stepped aside. Ruth walked in. The room was bright. A window faced east, letting the light pour in across a tidy bed. There was a small table beside it, covered in books, a glass of water, and a single letter in a pale blue envelope. Her letter. And there he was, James Connors. Older, thinner, grayer than the boy she had known. But it was him. His hair had thinned, his face lined deeply, but the eyes were the same, that soft brown, full of thought, full of history. He turned when he heard her steps. Their eyes met. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Ruth crossed the room slowly, then sat in the chair beside his bed. His hands were folded on his lap. She saw the scar on his left forearm, the one he got when he slipped on the riverbank that summer. He had told her it would never heal straight. It had not. James finally spoke. Ruth. Her name came out like breath, like a word he had practiced 1,000 times in silence. She smiled, though her eyes were already full. You look the same, he said. You liar. They both laughed, soft and broken, the sound catching somewhere between grief and relief. I thought you were gone, she said. I thought I should be, he answered. I was not the same after the war. I had nightmares. I had a lot of anger and guilt. And I thought if I came back to you like that, I would ruin everything good you ever had. So you disappeared? I was going to write you when I got better. But better never came the way I thought it would. Then Carl said you had married. I figured you had your life. Ruth nodded slowly. I did. I married a good man, had children, grandchildren. But that does not mean I forgot you. He looked down at the envelope on the table. When your letter came, I could not believe it. I read it 10 times before I let Claire read it out loud. My eyes are not what they used to be. You never married? No, I never wanted anyone else. That part of me stayed with you. Ruth felt the tears come then. Quiet ones, the kind that carried a lifetime. She reached for his hand. He let her take it. It was warm, real, alive. They sat like that for a long time. No need to fill the air with stories or explanations. The truth of it was all around them. In the quiet, in the touch, in the way they kept looking at each other like trying to remember and trying to believe all at once. You waited, she said. So did you. I wish I had written sooner. I am just glad you wrote at all. Outside the window, the sun had risen higher. Light poured across the blankets. It touched his face, and for a moment, Ruth could see him as he had been. The boy with wind in his hair and a poem in his pocket. They did not talk about what came next. There were no promises, no plans, just presence. And for now, that was enough. Ruth leaned forward and kissed his forehead. You are still my favorite mistake, she whispered. He smiled with his eyes closed. You were never a mistake. When Ruth walked out of the room, Linda stood waiting in the hallway. Well, Ruth smiled. He remembered everything. The quiet days, the days that followed, moved slowly. Not the kind of slow that drags or aches, but the kind that feels deliberate, soft, like the world knew something important had happened and was giving Ruth time to breathe. She and Linda stayed in Clearwater. Claire offered them the spare bedroom in James's house, but Ruth said no, gently. Some spaces should remain sacred. Instead, they found a modest inn on the edge of town with creaky floorboards and a kettle that always seemed to be whistling. Ruth liked it immediately. Each morning, she and Linda drove the hour and 20 minutes to Missoula. The first day, James was tired. They sat mostly in silence, watching the trees outside his window and letting the breeze carry in the scent of pine. He dozed off midway through a story Ruth was telling about her granddaughter's school play. She did not mind. She kept talking anyway. The second day, he was sharper. He remembered Ruth's favorite candy, lemon drops, told her about a camping trip he once took to Glacier National Park, said he thought about her every time he saw a river. The third day, Ruth brought an old photo album. Not the whole thing. Just a few pages she had tucked into a manila envelope. Pictures of Linda as a baby. The house Harold built. Christmas morning with pajamas and messy hair, and coffee mugs, too big for the little hands holding them. James held each one like it was made of glass. She showed him a picture of Harold, too. That your husband? She nodded. He was a good man, James said quietly. You chose well. So did you, Ruth said, glancing toward the framed photo of Claire on the bedside table. James smiled. I never had much, but she was enough. That afternoon, the hospice nurse brought them tea and shortbread cookies. Ruth stayed until evening. When she kissed James goodbye, he pressed her hand to his cheek. Thank you for finding me, he whispered. You were never lost, Ruth said. Just waiting. Back at the inn that night, Ruth sat in the armchair by the window, wrapped in a quilt. Linda handed her a cup of chamomile tea and sat beside her on the bed. How are you feeling? Ruth took a long sip. Like something inside me has stopped aching. Linda looked at her mother, really looked, and saw something she had not seen in years. A stillness, a kind of peace. Do you regret anything? Ruth shook her head. Not anymore. She looked out the window. The stars were out. The sky above Montana was so wide it made you feel small in a way that did not hurt. You know, she said after a while, I always thought healing would be loud, like a door slamming shut or a wave crashing. But it is not. It is quiet. It is tea in the afternoon. It is a voice you have not heard in 50 years saying your name like it still matters. Linda reached for her hand and held it. The days passed gently. Sometimes Ruth read to James. Sometimes she just sat beside him, holding his hand while he slept. He was growing weaker. They both knew it. But neither said so. They talked about the past, not just the love they lost, but the world they grew up in. Gasoline at 20 cents a gallon, drive-in theaters, wool coats that smelled like snow. They laughed at old stories, fell into comfortable silence. Ruth told him about the time Harold accidentally backed over a mailbox and blamed the dog. James told her about a fishing trip that ended with a bear chasing him into a lake. They were not rushing. There was no need. Ruth had come to Montana for closure. What she found instead was a kind of opening, a quiet acceptance that time does not erase love. It changes it, softens it, tucks it into new corners of the heart. And love, once planted, keeps growing, even in the quiet days, especially then. The final goodbye. The call came on a Sunday morning. Ruth was sitting on the porch of the inn, wrapped in her shawl, sipping coffee that had long gone lukewarm. The air smelled of pine and the first hints of frost. Birds called out in soft, tentative bursts, as if unsure whether to greet the day or stay hidden. Her phone rang from the little table beside her. She answered without hesitation. "Is this Ruth?" "Yes, this is Nurse Emily from the VA Center. I am with Mr. Connors. He is asking for you." Is it time?" "He is still with us, but it may not be long. He said your name 3 times. Clear as day. He is waiting." Ruth stood. Linda appeared in the doorway behind her, already dressed, car keys in hand. Somehow, she had known too. They drove in silence. The hospice room was quiet when they arrived. The sun was streaming through the east-facing window. James was lying back, eyes closed. But when Ruth stepped through the door, his eyes fluttered open. "You made it," he whispered. "Of course I did." She crossed the room and took his hand. It felt smaller than before, bony, but still warm. Claire stood at the foot of the bed, her hands folded gently in front of her. She nodded to Ruth, then slipped quietly from the room. Linda stayed in the hallway, just the two of them now. James looked at her for a long time, his eyes drifting over her face like he was memorizing every part of it. "You are still beautiful," he said softly. Ruth smiled and leaned closer. "You always say that when you are about to get your way." They both laughed, a quiet, dry laugh that carried a lifetime. There was a long pause. James, voice barely above a whisper, said, "I am sorry." "For what?" "For leaving. For not being stronger. For not writing again. For every year we lost." Ruth shook her head gently. "No, you gave me something that never left me. Even when you did, you were my first home. And in some strange way, you stayed with me. Even when I was happy, even when I had a full life, there was still a piece of you folded into everything." She reached for the letter on the table. Her letter. She held it up. "I almost did not send this, but you did." He looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. "Do you remember what I wrote to you back then? In that last letter?" Ruth nodded. "If you ever need me, just write me back. I will be waiting." He smiled faintly. "And you did. It took me 50 years. I did not mind the wait." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of years, of longing, of all the moments they never got to share, but still carried in their hearts. James's breathing grew slower. Ruth did not speak. She just held his hand and let the light touch both their faces. When he finally closed his eyes, she knew. Not because of the sound, not because of the stillness, but because of the feeling. Like something had settled, like something had come home. She sat beside him a long time after that. No one came in, no one needed to. When she finally rose to leave, she leaned down and kissed his forehead one last time. "Thank you for waiting," she whispered. Then she turned and walked into the hallway, where Linda stood waiting. "It's over," Ruth said quietly. Linda wrapped her arms around her mother. "No," she said softly. "It's just finished." They stepped outside. The wind had picked up slightly. The trees moved with it, not against it. And in the quiet that followed, Ruth felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt whole. The stillness that followed. The train whistle passed through town 2 days after Ruth returned home. It was not loud, just a low, distant sound that hummed across the hills like an old memory. She was sitting on the porch when she heard it, wrapped in her cardigan, a cup of chamomile tea cooling beside her. The birch trees in the front yard had lost nearly all their leaves. They blanketed the grass in gold and rust, softening every step. Linda had stayed for one more night, then returned to her own home. The goodbye had been quiet. Just a long hug, a few shared smiles, and a promise to come back soon. Now it was just Ruth again. But the silence felt different now. Not heavy, not empty, just still. She had been unpacking slowly, folding clothes, putting things back where they belonged, one small task at a time. Yesterday, she put the kettle back on its usual burner. This morning, she reorganized the pantry. There was no hurry. The house seemed to understand. It waited with her, moved with her, as if recognizing something had changed. On the table by the window sat the photograph Claire had given her before they left Montana. It was James, standing at the edge of a lake, his fishing pole resting against his shoulder, mountains in the background, the sky wide open above him. He was smiling, just slightly, like someone who had finally made peace with his own story. Beside it was the letter, her letter, folded, worn at the edges now, but still intact. Sometimes she would reach out and touch it, not to read it, not to relive it, just to remind herself that it had been real. There were no more tears, not now, just breath, long, slow breaths that came easier than they had in years. That afternoon, she walked out to the mailbox. There was nothing inside. A few leaves swirled at her feet as she turned to head back toward the house. Halfway up the walk, she stopped. She looked up at the sky, blue, empty, beautiful. Then she went inside and opened the drawer by the kitchen sink. From the back, she pulled out an envelope, blank, clean. She sat at the table. For a moment, she just looked at it. Then she picked up her pen. "Dear Harold." She paused. It felt strange, writing to him after so long, but not wrong. "I saw him. He waited. And now I am home." She set the pen down. That was all she needed to say. She folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. She did not seal it. Instead, she placed it in the old wooden box with the others. Then she poured herself a cup of tea and carried it to the window. Outside, the wind stirred the last few leaves from the branches. Inside, Ruth took a sip. She looked at the photo, then at the sunlight dancing across the floor. There was no music, no fireworks, no great declaration, just stillness, and the soft certainty that some goodbyes are not about endings. They are about release. The years that remain winter came early that year. Snow fell in late October, covering the yard like a hush. The birch trees stood bare and graceful, their white bark striking against the gray sky. Ruth watched the first snowfall from her kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a mug of black tea. She had started drinking it plain again. Something about it felt honest, uncomplicated. Her movements had slowed. She walked with more care now, used the railing when stepping off the porch, and took her time climbing the stairs at night. But her spirit felt lighter, less like something she had to carry, and more like something that carried her. She had begun writing again, not to James, not to Harold, but to herself. Little notes, small memories. She kept a notepad by the chair near the window. Some mornings she would write a line or two about the weather. Some afternoons, a memory would come to her so suddenly she would have to sit down to catch it. The scent of sawdust from Harold's workshop, the feel of James's flannel shirt on her cheek, the sound of Linda laughing in the back seat on the way to the lake. She did not try to make sense of it. She just let it come. Claire wrote her once a week, sometimes more. Her letters were full of updates about the house, the dog she had recently adopted, and the garden she had planted in James's memory. Lavender, rosemary, and one stubborn rose bush that refused to bloom until mid-June. Ruth always looked forward to those envelopes, hand-addressed and sealed with a small sticker of a bluebird or a leaf. She wrote back too, not long letters, but thoughtful ones. She had grown fond of Claire, not just because she had cared for James, but because she had offered Ruth something unexpected in the last chapter of her life: connection. Ruth did not travel again. She did not need to. Everything she had chased, everything she had buried, had come full circle. The box of letters remained where it had always been, tucked into the drawer beneath the china cabinet. But she no longer opened it in secret. Sometimes, when the grandkids visited, she would show them one or two, tell them stories not just about their grandfather Harold, but about the life that came before him. They listened with wide eyes, never once judging. To them, it was just another piece of the woman they loved, their grandmother, who made the best pancakes and still knew the lyrics to every old Patsy Cline song. One evening, as the sky turned to a soft shade of plum, Linda stopped by after work. She found Ruth sitting on the porch with a blanket on her knees and a book resting on the arm of the chair. "You look good, Mom." "I feel good." They sat together for a while, just watching the clouds move. "Do you ever think about going back to Montana?" Linda asked. Ruth smiled. "Every day, but not the way I used to. I do not long for it. I just carry it with me now." Linda reached for her hand. "I am proud of you," she said. "For what?" "For not letting the past harden you." Ruth thought about that for a long moment. "The past is not something to fight," she said. "It is something to hold gently, like an old photograph. You do not keep staring at it, but you also do not throw it away." The wind stirred the trees. A crow passed overhead, calling out once before disappearing over the rooftop. As the sun slipped lower, Ruth leaned back in her chair. She was not waiting anymore. She was simply living, not counting the days, but filling them, one soft morning at a time. The message. If you asked her what she had learned, Ruth would not answer right away. She would pause, maybe tilt her head a little, as if listening for something far off. The wind through birch trees, the rustle of paper, the echo of someone long gone, calling her name. She would probably smile a little, not out of politeness, but from a deep place that had learned to trust the silence between words. Eventually, she might say this: "Time does not heal everything." That is something people say when they do not know what else to offer. A sentence to cover the ache. But it is not true. Some things are never healed. They are simply carried, folded into us, like old letters. Some days, you forget they are there. Other days, they press hard against your chest until you remember. And remembering is not weakness. It is love, choosing to keep speaking long after the story should have ended. She might tell you that waiting does not mean standing still. Waiting is living while holding a door open. It is doing the dishes and folding laundry and laughing at jokes and raising children, all while a quiet part of your soul stands at the window, watching for something you may never see again. She waited 50 years. But what mattered most was not that James came back into her life. It was that she let herself open the letter. It was that she said yes to the voice in her that still wanted to know. That she listened to the part of herself that never stopped hoping, even when she told it to hush. That she wrote his name one more time, not out of grief, but out of love. And what did it give her? Not answers, not perfection, but peace. And peace is not loud. Peace is a rocking chair on a quiet porch. It is the smell of tea in the morning. It is a letter read once more before the sun sets. Peace is letting go of what never happened and holding tight to what did. If you ever asked Ruth what to do with old love, she would say this: do not bury it. Do not run from it. Let it sit beside you. Let it teach you. Let it remind you that you were once someone who loved deeply, even if it did not last in the way you hoped. Because loving, truly loving, is never wasted. It becomes a part of you. It becomes a light you carry. And sometimes, even after all the years, that light finds its way back to you, just as it did for her. She was not young when it happened, but love had never asked her to be. Love only asked her to be open, to be honest, to be brave enough to remember. And in the end, that was her message. Do not be afraid of the long wait. Do not be ashamed of the quiet longing. You are not broken. You are simply someone who still believes. And that, she would say, is the most beautiful kind of strength there is.